So now, you've got people that, you've got households that suddenly have disposable income. And so these households, and I think like rightly so, are thinking about, what do I buy with this? Where do I spend my money? Like what matters? And they're thinking about experiences. They're thinking about consumerism. They're not thinking about
degrowth.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's 2 or 3 generations that have benefited from a tremendous amount of growth in the region. And I think, where we are at the moment is that emissions and growth in Southeast Asia is very, very closely linked.
Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. One of the priorities we set at the beginning of the year was to spend more time outside the US, Europe, and China, focusing on what we call most of world. That's where 70% of the global population lives, a huge amount and a growing amount of energy demand and of the economy, and most of the demographic growth. So I'm here in Singapore. It coincides with Ecosperity Week. I've been moderating sessions on AI, helping to launch an organization called FESIA, which is the Future Energy Storage and System Integration Alliance, and also hosting a number of Cleaning Up Leadership Circle events. My guest today is a business builder and venture capitalist operating across South and Southeast Asia. She runs a fund called WaveMaker Impact, and she's going to be spinning out an organization called 100 by 100, which we're going to hear about. I am really hoping that you enjoy this conversation for a reason that we will reveal towards the end of our conversation. So please welcome Marie Cheong to Cleaning Up. Marie, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, we're going to start where we always start, which is with you describing, who you are and what you do in your own words. And then we've got lots of good stuff because we did the visit yesterday and we'll get into that. But first of all, who are you and what do you do?
Fantastic. Okay, so my name is Marie and I'm a founding partner of a climate tech venture builder and VC firm called 100 by 100. Maybe before I launch into that, I'll say that I am relatively new to VC. I consider myself to be a very reluctant venture capitalist. The real passion that I had coming into this was, this question that was in my mind is, how can we build companies that could meaningfully decarbonize the world? And that set me on a journey that started about 5 or 6 years ago, really trying to explore what kind of business models are out there that are scalable and can be needle moving, especially for a region like South and Southeast Asia. So what we try to do at 100 by 100 is we're on a mission to build a portfolio of companies that can abate 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we do that by working with experienced entrepreneurs. So these are founders that have built companies before, scaled them and exited, and are somehow crazy enough to want to do it again and want to do it with something with impact. And we work with them over a period of 6 months to build what we call a 100 by 100 company. So these are companies that have the potential to abate 100 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and be $100 million revenue businesses at scale.
And I was going to ask you about the 100 by 100 because that's going to be a big feature of your future. It's going to be part of the brand, and you're spinning that out. But I was wondering whether you're going to try to build 100 of them.
Well, so the whole idea is that if we had 50 100 by 100 companies, then that would be 5 gigatons of emissions that we would have abated, and that's the 10% goal. So that's what we're trying to get to. So then the big question is, in order to get those 50 successful companies, how many other companies do you have to build on that mission?
Because you spun through very quickly, you said you're a venture builder and VC, and then you filled in a little bit of what I was about to ask, which is what does being a venture builder mean? And it is about working with those entrepreneurs to make the company happen rather than just being a passive venture investor, right?
Yeah, exactly. So when we first launched this in 2021, we looked around the region, and climate tech is incredibly nascent in this region. So Southeast Asia is about 7% of global carbon emissions, but gets less than 3% of VC funding in the space. So there just simply aren't enough companies to launch a meaningful VC strategy just for climate tech in the region. What we do have, on the other hand, is an incredible pool of talent. So we have founders that have built, scaled, and exited tech companies that have been early employees in some of the unicorns in the region. We also have a group of founders that have built, I would say, more traditional brick and mortar businesses that have gotten reasonably large and then have decided to exit those. So we've got an incredible pool of talent that are interested in doing something meaningful. So interestingly, about 50% of our founders come to us having already started to look at climate because, they've got kids, they read what's going on in the news. And another 50% of them are just people who are passionate to do something to solve big problems for the world with urgency. So they've been looking at health tech, they've been looking at ed tech, they've been looking at issues like water, and they've been looking at issues like climate, but they haven't found a space. And part of our thesis is that there's a misconception around climate that it's all about these silver bullet technologies. It's nuclear fusion and direct air carbon capture. That's what's going to save us. But we can abate 50% of global carbon emissions using the technology that we have today. There's green discounts everywhere. And these are, I would say, more engineering problems than they are tech problems.
This resonates with me. I love it because I actually bridle at this sort of the silver bullet thinking. And I wrote a piece for The Economist in response to a piece that had been written by Vinod Khosla. And Vinod Khosla was saying, don't invest in any of these things. All of this wind, solar, batteries, all the stuff that we've got, it's all pointless because it can't solve the whole problem and it can't scale. And what we need is, and then he listed a whole bunch of essentially technologies that he had invested in. And it was things like superconducting transmission lines and, of course, the usual of fusion and small modular reactors and so on. It was either in it or implied. And I've got nothing against those technologies. I've just done too much of what I do, tracking the actual energy system, to think that those things are going to suddenly materialize and suddenly be rolled out at scale and within 2, 3, 4 decades, because it's just such a big and complicated system. And so we've kind of got to do both. Yeah, is the answer. But you are the anti-bro VC in a way, because you only want to do the stuff that can work now in this region.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, another great example that I know we've talked about in the past is hydrogen. And I mean, we've been talking about hydrogen in this region for at least the last decade, right? And it's nowhere close to really being able to have the impact that it needs to be meaningful. On the other hand, we've recently launched a solar consumer appliance business. So selling solar lights, solar fans, solar fridges and freezers to tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And the revenue of that company, I mean, first revenue was in weeks of launching, and the growth rate is incredible. And so I think it's there's a couple of things here. So I think one is there is a skip the landline moment that is possible in Southeast Asia. The phrase like the best coal-fired power plant is the one that's never been built. So energy demand in Southeast Asia is set to double in the next 20 years. And what is that driven by, right? That's driven by people buying air conditions for the first time for their homes. The people who are now buying a car instead of having, a two-wheeler. And so all of these things, we have the opportunity now to green it at the point of demand rather than having to wait for a big energy transition to happen.
I love the phrase "skip the landline" moment because I've been talking about leapfrogging, and I don't understand why leapfrogging hasn't been a big word in, for instance, the COP process. But "skip the landline" moment is so. It's so obvious what you mean by that. Before we dive into the visit we did yesterday, which was so much fun, there's a couple of other things. Give us the metrics. How many portfolio companies? How much money have you got under management? How many people? What have you achieved? You said this all started around 2021, 2022. Metrics.
Yeah. So when we started in 2021, we were a completely new product in the market, right? So venture building was new, climate was new for the region. So we set out to raise 25 million and we ended up hitting our hard cap of 60 million. So 60 million USD under management.
Oh, acronym alert. You know our rules here. USD is, of course, US dollars, but we just make it clear in case anybody listening has any doubt.
Keep me honest. We now have 23 companies in our portfolio. So these are 23 companies going after the biggest drivers of emissions in the region. Everything from rice cultivation. Rice is the second largest driver of agricultural emissions globally. To 2 companies, one in Indonesia and one in India that is creating a drop-in replacement for coal from agricultural waste, to companies in the built environment, for example, a bamboo company producing an alternative to wood products, and 2 AI companies recently, one tackling overproduction in the fashion industry, and another Moon AI, which we'll talk more about later.
Absolutely. And then the other thing we need to clarify before we go further is the region. And, it was one of the things that I've wanted to do with cleaning up. It's been a strategic goal for Bryony and I. We decided with the editorial council that we wanted to really represent or showcase or understand what we call most of world. So that's not the US, Europe, China, which grab most of the airwaves in energy discussions and climate discussions. So that's why I'm here. It's Ecosperity Week, so it's a great opportunity. And I'm off to Australia, which is also part of most of world. But some definitions for me, you can test me, and for the audience, because, okay, there is Asia, and we all kind of know what Asia is, and it starts from the Bosphorus and it goes all the way across. Yeah. But then you've got these other terms that you've already started to use. And because you knew this was coming, you were very careful. You said South and Southeast Asia. So what is Southeast Asia? Let's start there.
So Southeast Asia is generally about 11 countries that is a part of ASEAN, which is the Alliance for Southeast Asian Nations. So that includes Singapore, of course, but also Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia. Okay, Michael, who have I left out?
Oh, there's, I don't know, because at the fringes, Brunei is absolutely in there, but Papua New Guinea is an observer, and then you've got, what's the one that I always forget? But it's quite easy from a European or the US perspective to just kind of know these countries exist, but not really to understand. Do we get a sense of population as a whole? I mean, you've got some quite big ones in there. You've got, the Malaysias, the Indonesias, the Philippines.
Indonesia's about 200 million people.
Right, exactly. So, so we're into the sort of 500 million-ish type population, most likely. I haven't done my homework, and it looks like you haven't either.
I know. So, failing the pub quiz now.
You know what we'll do? We'll put that information in the show notes. There we go. That's the scoundrel's refuge for me at this point. But it does not include. So when you say South and Southeast Asia.
Yes.
So that's then not just the ASEAN, Southeast Asia countries. That starts to include?
So South Asia is India, Bangladesh, Pakistan.
Okay, and the reason it's confusing is if you look on a map, it's not obvious why that's South Asia. Yes. I mean, it's South relative to sort of China, but it's not South relative to Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines. But that would then be South and Southeast Asia. And that's really what you're talking about as the area that you're going to invest in, correct?
Yes, that's right. So we started in Southeast Asia. That's our backyard. Southeast Asia, as I mentioned, is about 7% of global carbon emissions, but scattered, right, across 11 nations. So it's different than, for example, when we look at India, which is also about 7% of global emissions, but is a single country.
And of course, India referred to as the subcontinent because it's mainly, obviously there are some islands involved and so on, but it's mainly a block, whereas Southeast Asia, you could say, I'm hesitating, I have to check my terminology every time. Yeah. Southeast Asia is a lot of islands. You have a very different sort of structure of the land mass and the issues around access to ocean and industries and transport requirements and so on.
Absolutely. And, it's also one of the regions that is most vulnerable to climate change. I know it's not in vogue anymore to talk about climate change, but it is a real threat. Over 100 million people in Southeast Asia rely on coastal regions for their livelihoods. We see all the time in the region the effects of unstable weather conditions, both on crops, both on coastal regions, typhoons, which are hurricanes. So it's a vulnerable region. Bangkok, as an example, could be underwater by 2050. With rising sea levels.
Although, when you say that, I've immediately got my sort of, have a different klaxon, which is, hang on a second, because Jakarta, people say that about Jakarta.
Yeah.
And Jakarta could be, has a huge flooding problem because most of that is caused by over-extraction from the aquifers. You build lots of skyscrapers on squishy land and then you take all the water out and not surprisingly it sinks. But the sea levels are also rising. So your point is a good one.
Maybe just to extend it a little bit more, I think what is valuable to think about is stranded assets. So, this region has grown tremendously in the last 50 years. You talk about skyscrapers. I mean, the cities in Southeast Asia are modern metropolises. And billions have gone into infrastructure. And that's really what is kind of at risk when we talk about climate risk.
Absolutely. And I got a bonus question, which is because as I was thinking about islands, having said that India, of course, is a subcontinent and it's a big block, but you've got Seychelles, Maldives, Mauritius, places like that. Are they South Asia or are they Southeast Asia? Does it matter?
Can the listeners refer to the show notes on that one?
Okay, we'll put definitions. And I'm being slightly sort of, we're having a bit of fun here, but these definitions, they do matter because, of course, you are operationalizing a business. You're running a business and what you don't invest in is as important strategically as what you do. So you would look at opportunities and you do look at opportunities. Do you already have portfolio companies in India do you look at Bangladesh and Pakistan as well?
So India is our primary focus in South Asia. We have 3 companies there at the moment, and we are investing in another 2, hopefully in the next few months.
So you can get your revenge by asking me about CPTPP, because I was on the board of trade when that was negotiated, and that is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which for some reason includes the UK.
Wow.
But we're very happy to be in it because trade is a key part of what actually is bringing your regions up economically, right?
Southeast Asia is a supply chain hub for the world. So, if you're buying clothes in H&M, if, the shoes that you're wearing, chances are that these are produced in Southeast Asia. Even kind of like, your plastics is a big production here. So,
or if they're not produced here, then they will have passed through here because they may be produced in China, but there are the Straits of Malacca and there's all sorts of complications. But one of the things that's very striking about the region is the diversity. I mean, you have Singapore, literally the highest GDP per capita of all of the advanced economies. And then you've also got Papua New Guinea, which is maybe it's only an observer, but there is this huge range of wealth, but also geographic and cultural diversity. You just have to go to the food marts here in Singapore and you can see the different peoples that there are in the region.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a great strength of the region. It adds to many of our cultural aspects. I think it also gives us a more global and international view from day one because you're so used to seeing so many different nationalities and cultures. I think the challenge from a VC and a business perspective is that to build a 100 company, the scale of companies that we are looking at, you have to go multi-country.
Klaxon alert, MT?
Million tons, megatons,
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to stick to the rules if I can.
Yeah. Keep me honest.
I'm the only person allowed to break them.
Can I give you an example?
Yes.
So one of our portfolio companies, Arisan, is doing small-scale consumer solar in Indonesia. Indonesia is I would say it's a fairly nascent market still when it comes to rooftop solar. And there is quite a lot of regulation to navigate. And one of the interesting things that we found there is that there's an opportunity to put a completely behind-the-meter, small-scale solar system with a battery attached to it. And do you know what the customer insight, which really unlocked it was? So PLN, which is the state energy company, they moved to a tokenized system. So you prepay for your electricity. So that means that every household has to go and buy a token. They have to top up their credits. And, you know, middle income families in these regions, or outside of Jakarta, you know, so tier 2, tier 3 cities, they think about having to top up their electricity all the time. So they're making choices like, do I run my washing machine today? Or before I have to go and top up my credits? And it's also quite common. We found when we went out and visited a bunch of these households that 80% of these households had at least one appliance that was broken. So their fridge could be broken or their rice cooker could be broken. Why? Because they're so used to their power getting cut on, you know, cutting in and out. And that, of course, shorts the electronics. And so when we sold these systems, the price point is low, right? It's the affordability of like a TV or a new fridge. So you're in kind of like the consumer price point here. But people were doing it not because of solar, not because of savings, but because they wanted to have the certainty that they wouldn't have to go and top up this token before they could run their washing machine.
Now, this is so exciting because we've now heard about people who've got range anxiety for a washing machine.
Exactly.
But that insight is absolutely
So here's
essential.
a challenge. So taking a company like Arisan, even though we know that small scale residential solar plus a battery could work in other markets from an income perspective and so on, that insight that really is allowing Arisan to grow at a tremendous rate in Indonesia doesn't necessarily, you know, translate to Vietnam, or it doesn't translate to Malaysia. So that is the challenge of building in a region like Southeast Asia.
It's also the reason why I can't just sit in London and bloviate about Southeast Asia and what it should and shouldn't do, or could or couldn't do, because those insights are absolutely, when you're a business builder, that is absolutely the level that you have to be operating at and understanding. Just talk to me briefly about the region's attitude to climate, the negotiations, what's going on in the Gulf, driving up and down energy prices. You know, how, my sense, let me give you on climate, my sense is that this region has never been quite as on board with the urgency of climate action. It has had other priorities to do with development and to do with bringing people out of poverty and providing modern energy services, and then just, you know, the daily bustle of living. But equally, it hasn't fallen out of love with climate action to the same extent that some countries, you know, not looking at you, US, but it hasn't been as extreme. It's neither been as sort of hysterically involved in climate action, but neither is it going to be stepping out now. Is that fair?
Well, okay, so there was probably a government and a policy angle, which I don't think I'm qualified to really talk about. But maybe I think from a public perception or a sentiment perspective. So, you know, what we're seeing now is an incredible growth in generational wealth. So in one generation, people have gone from being, I would say, very low income earners to suddenly having disposable household income. And it's a tremendous, there is a burgeoning middle class all across Southeast Asia. And it is fantastic to see.
Presumably they've also gone from rural, almost subsistence farming or rice farming to living in a city. So incredible generational change.
Yes, exactly. And so now, you know, you've got people that, you've got households that suddenly have disposable income. And so these households, and I think like rightly so, are thinking about, what do I buy with this? You know, like where do I spend my money? Like what matters? And they're thinking about experiences. They're thinking about consumerism. They're not thinking about
degrowth.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's, you know, 2 or 3 generations that have benefited from a tremendous amount of growth in the region. And I think, you know, where we are at the moment is that emissions and growth in Southeast Asia is very, very closely linked. So we haven't seen that delinking that happens in China, that happens in the EU. So when we say that the energy demand in Southeast Asia is set to double in the next 20 years, that is because our economies are growing. We're in a growth economy. So then when you think about the kind of the mindset of people, that, you know, they're life is good right now as a kind of a general rule, right? And kind of getting better. I think there's a lot of optimism in the region. And I think as a result, there's not so much of a focus on sustainability, on climate, on the energy transition. I will the caveat I will say to that is, for example, there's been a lot in the press around for example, the Philippines only having, I think it must be like 20 days left now of energy supply because of what's happening in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. And that's what has driven a tremendous demand for things like solar appliances. So Philippines is one of those unique economies where it's got a very liberal energy market, but it's also got the highest energy prices in the region. And it's got one of the most unstable grids. So brownouts are very, very common. So people are thinking about buying things like, larger scale battery systems. For example, one of our team members lives in a tier 2 city in the Philippines, and she plugs her Wi-Fi into a battery so she can continue to work from home. So that, these are these everyday kind of things. So I would say that's how people feel things like the energy crisis.
And that's why the idea of the skip the landline is so important, because if there is that enormous growth in energy demand, and I think that absolutely there is and there should be, and this is a good thing, but it can't just double down on using coal, which is a mainstay of most of these countries' energy power systems.
And the fastest or the easiest to grow, right? I mean, you don't have to. There's not huge investment. You don't have to think about intermittency. You just turn on another coal-fired power plant, right?
And a lot of the countries, Vietnam, Indonesia particularly, have got a lot of coal.
Yes.
So it's a very resilient fallback. And so that's something that I'm doing a lot of thinking about and talking to people about, how, yes, the coal is going to play that resilience role, but it doesn't have to run 24/7 at very high proportions of the electricity generation in order to do so. Can coal become more flexible, almost like the role that gas plays in Europe and will play increasingly?
So one of our big theses that we've been developing over the last 2 years in our fund is really this idea of greening energy demand, both at from a supply perspective and also from a demand perspective. So I think that the supply perspective, the large utility grade solar, I think there's a tremendous amount of work that's happening in the region around this, and I think it's very much needed. And there's big infra funds that are being launched. That is fantastic. But I think there's also a role to green, as we talked about, skipping the landline from the demand perspective.
So I don't know if you've had the opportunity to see a recent episode with Harish Hande, who's a friend of mine who works absolutely on that model, but with the very poorest in India, actually in East India. And he's talking about, you have to work out if somebody is rolling rotis or they're grinding millet.
Yeah.
Help them to do that. Oh, by the way, it's solar.
Yeah.
And then it's easier to get finance from the banks because there's an economic rationale. It's a wonderful model. Cleaning Up is proud to be supported by its leadership circle. The members are Actis, Alcazar Energy, Arup, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, Signum Capital, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP, Euroelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, Schneider Electric, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. To keep up with all that's going on in the Cleaning Up universe, make sure you subscribe to our newsletter. Written and edited by my longtime New Energy Finance and Bloomberg NEF colleague, Angus McCrone, it comes out every second Monday. Angus provides the latest on the episodes we're recording, the events we're hosting, stories we're watching, and what Bryony Worthington and I are up to. To sign up for the Cleaning Up newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. I think what we need to do is introduce the visit that we went on, one of your portfolio companies. It's Catherine Knight is the entrepreneur, Moon AI. Just give us the quick studio version, and then we'll cut to what we were doing yesterday, but we're talking about vermicelli noodles.
Yes, exactly. I'm so happy that we were able to make that happen. And maybe if I could just set a little bit of context. So manufacturing in Southeast Asia emits a gigaton a year. And to put that in context, right? A gigaton is the equivalent of SAF. Like, if we're talking about like aviation fuel. And so when there is
sustainable aviation fuel.
Sustainable aviation. But when we talk about, going after big emitters.
Or non-sustainable aviation fuel.
Exactly.
I mean, essentially, it's about 2% of global emissions. And that's just manufacturing in Southeast Asia.
Correct.
That's not the whole region. The whole region is 7%, you said, and the manufacturing is 2% of all emissions globally. So it's significant.
Yeah. It's very big. And about half of that, we estimate from our calculations, come from SME manufacturing. This is the heartbeat, I think, of the manufacturing economy that exists in this region. So I was very happy that we were able to kind of show you this. And we have a number of companies that are looking to address some of the challenges of the green transition in SME manufacturing. And Moon AI is our latest example of that. So Desmond, who is the CEO of People Bihun Factory, this is a family-owned business. I think they said they've been operating since 1947. It's been around a long time. It's a noodle factory, right? There's lots of thermal processes. Steaming is one of the big elements of this. Cooking noodles, lots of boiling water everywhere. And interestingly, Desmond has invested in, Industry 4.0, right? So he's put a lot of IoT devices on, for example, all of his steaming chambers that is producing terabytes and terabytes of data. And there's nothing that is actually being done with this.
Devices. Let's just call them sensors.
Okay, sensors.
I don't know what IoT stands for.
Internet of Things.
Internet of Things. Otherwise known as sensors.
So in an incredibly data-rich factory, but insight poor. Like, what do you do with this data that is being generated? How can you use this data to optimize factory operations? And that's where Moon AI comes in. There's two elements of what they provide. So the first is being able to ingest and label an incredible amount of data in a very short period of time. And then the second is the model that they build on top of that to enable businesses like People Bihun to get real insights out of it. So for example, there are different steaming chambers that are core to this process. And we've discovered that a number of these steaming chambers are steaming for too long.
Just to be clear, your investment was in Moon AI, so that is Catherine, whom we also are about to meet, and not directly in the noodle factory. Right? You do not invest in noodle factories. Just if anybody's, you might in another life, but not this one. Yeah. And so we're going to meet Catherine Knight, and we're going to meet Desmond Go, who is the visionary, really, CEO of People's Bihun or People Bihun Noodle Factory.
That's right.
So here we are at a noodle factory. Remind us, why are we here? What are we visiting?
25% of all emissions in Southeast Asia comes from things like manufacturing. And I would love to be able to show you one of our portfolio companies, Moon AI, which is working with People's Bihun Factory to work on the energy transition here.
Okay, and People's Bihun Factory, what do they make?
They make noodles of all kinds. They make bihun, rice-based vermicelli, all kinds of noodles.
Okay, so this is like peak Singapore, isn't it? Vermicelli noodles.
Yeah.
And this is a factory.
Southeast Asia.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Let's go inside and find out more.
Excellent. Michael, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Desmond. He is the owner of People's Bihun Factory.
Hello. Hi, Michael.
Desmond, very good to meet you.
And this is Catherine. She is the founder and CEO of Moon AI.
People Bihun Factory was founded in 1943 and makes Singapore's classic rice vermicelli noodles. The factory is now run by family member Desmond Go, who took us inside and showed us the hive of activity with mixers, extruders, steamers and dryers making hundreds of meters of noodles per minute. Earlier this year, Desmond teamed up with Catherine Knight, founding CEO of Moon AI, to see how artificial intelligence could make People Bihun Factory more energy efficient. Catherine, tell us, how did this all start?
Okay, so a little about myself. Catherine, founder and CEO of Moon AI. Actually, I spent the past 15 years in applied AI. So not just AI in the theoretical sense, but how we can use AI to achieve real business outcomes and also now with Moon AI, sustainability outcomes.
Those steamers that you're now monitoring, you're getting a row of data every second.
Yeah, that's petabytes of data. So what we're able to do is we take raw data, raw machine data, and turn it into actionable intelligence for operators like Desmond. So what does that mean? We're creating a true baseline of how the machines are actually operating. So we can see anomalies, drift, before something goes wrong, before the machine breaks or before like a failed batch. So for example, you saw 5 chambers there. 2 of the chambers are over processing by maybe 20, 25 minutes.
So cooking,
per cycle.
Steaming for too long.
Steaming for too long.
Right.
We've seen in one of the chambers, there is potentially a seal leakage because there's a drift in terms of the pressure ramps and how it's sustaining. And these are things that we were able to uncover in just weeks' time versus, he's been sitting on these data for years.
What I love is also that your, approach, your tools, your intellect is being applied to noodle steaming, not to investment banking. This is great.
Yes, it's so refreshing. Walking the factory floor is so much more fun and interesting and colorful. My life is much more colorful now.
So now, Marie, how did you source this as a venture investment for 100 by 100?
So we talk to about 1,000 founders every year to find 8 or so founders that we end up building companies with. So we met Catherine as a part of that process. So we're talking to hundreds of founders, and we were really impressed by Catherine's experience, by her genuine commitment to use her skills and her talents to do something meaningful in climate and to solve real problems, in the real world. And then we worked together for 6 months to identify a space that was at an intersection between the skills that she brought to the table, her previous experience, as well as some of the biggest carbon opportunities in the region.
So when you met her and talked to her first, the company did not yet exist? Or? No. Okay.
We built Moon AI together over a 6-month period of time. And then at the point at which we were confident that this was 100 by 100 opportunities, so a company with the ability to abate 100 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and be a $100 million revenue business at scale. And I think more importantly, Catherine was excited by this opportunity and thought she could do something meaningful in the space. That's when we wrote our first check.
And how long ago was that?
3 months, 3-4 months. Yeah.
$100 million of revenue. How are you doing?
Great. No.
Almost there.
On our way.
Outside the factory, Marie caught up with Desmond to ask about how he's using AI and data from the factory's machinery to improve his business.
So Desmond, how have you used the data so far?
So far, I think we are still in the infancy stages of collecting data. So we are still trying to figure out how we can make sense of all these data as well. Yeah, and then from there, then we will decide how and which parts are we going to automate. Because when you have all these data that are measurable, then you will know what good looks like and what not good looks like. Yeah.
And what was the motivation for working with Moon AI?
Because I think we are quite intrigued at how this AI thing can help us, and I think for AI in particular, from what we understand, is very good at passing through a lot of data and making sense. And I think you've seen we have a lot of data.
Terabytes and terabytes of data. Yeah.
And I think we don't have operators that are skilled enough to be able to process all these real time and then make that split-second decision. So yes, and that's why we when Catherine came and proposed this solution, we thought, okay, why not? We should give it a shot. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for giving us a shot with Moon AI and hosting us today. I think we have to do a formal. Yeah.
Desmond, thank you very, very much for hosting us.
Much.
It's absolutely fascinating. You made me hungry.
Maybe we can go for lunch.
I love the visit, partly because I used to do lots of work in the food industry. And so it's just very nostalgic for me to wander around where there's pallets of raw materials and then there's, steaming and cooking and drying type processes. But it's really it brings home something really interesting, which is, and you used the phrase that carbon happens or emissions happen in the real world.
Yes.
I don't know, what's the phrase you use?
Emissions live in the real world.
Emissions live in the real world. You're so good at this.
Yeah.
And if we don't change how noodles are made, then we're not really going to solve for emissions. It doesn't matter how many PowerPoints we do or conferences we attend in air-conditioned Singapore hotels, we're not going to fix the problem. So that's what the problem really looks like, and that's what the solutions really look like.
Yeah. And, you've got to find the right incentives, right? Desmond is a good businessman, and he's making choices about the future of his business, profitability of his business. So we've got to take it away from the ideological, we have to do this for climate, to let's try to figure out how to decarbonize this business in a way that makes sense for this business. And so I was actually, one of my favorite bits of the visit, Michael, was when I saw your eyes light up at one point, and it was almost kind of like the, oh yeah. And so, and we had a few conversations about it, but I think it might be interesting. I'd love for you to share with the audience what you saw.
So I think the oh yeah moment was in fact the dryer, not the steamers.
Yes,
so the steamers where, Catherine is collecting the data on the steamers, and already, her eyes light up because you're already seeing differences in performance and noodles being cooked too long, or steamed for too long, which is wasting money. And I think the noodles are fine, but it's not good for business. So she was very excited about that. But I was looking at the dryer because we walked into this room and there's a big dryer, and it's actually circulating steam to dry the noodles so they can be packaged, but it's using natural gas to make the steam. Mm-hmm. And one of the companies that I've been involved in is a company called Heaton. It's an industrial heat pump company that makes steam at up to 200 degrees centigrade. And so you could power that process using a heat pump much more efficiently and much more cleanly, even, by the way, if you use natural gas, right? Because you could go natural gas to make electricity to drive a heat pump with coefficient performance of 4 or 5 or something like that. And you would actually be saving gas and saving emissions. But also you could then start layering in maybe solar power or power coming in from a cable from, there's all sorts of, there's the ASEAN power grid that's under discussion. So maybe you'll get more green electricity from one of your neighboring countries here in Singapore, and you can start to see a real pathway. So I was just doing my thermo geek out about the dryer.
We saw it.
And I was also perfectly happy with the optimization of the opportunity that AI offered. And in a way, maybe
complementary, right?
They're complementary, exactly. Yeah. So you've got to have the right thermal process, and then you've got to optimize and manage it right. Yeah. And so I think it's so illustrative to get out into those businesses and see them and understand the challenges at that granular level. That was my takeaway.
Yeah. It's my favorite part of the job. Visiting factories, visiting farms across the region, because then you really get an appreciation of, sure, the challenges, but also the tremendous amount of opportunity to do something at a green discount, right?
Did you notice there was something else that I did was to ask about the waste and the offcuts, what happens to them? Because from my previous life, I know that in most food factories, the waste is produced and it goes off, and it can either be reuse, which is what they were saying they do. They sort of put it back into the process. Or it can be a problem. And if you've got a waste rate of 2-3-4%, well, guess what? That is 2-3-4% of the emissions, of the costs of that factory. It can also be a disposal problem, depending on how you're allowed to use it. Mostly in food, it will go into the animal food chain and so on.
But there's issues. One of the spaces that we think Moon AI is going to sell really well in the F&B manufacturing sector is actually around batch rejects, because rejected product costs businesses hundreds of thousands of dollars every month. And so, if you can reduce that through better optimization, better prediction, then you're saving money for for these businesses, but doing it in a way that it also contributes positively to decarbonisation.
100%. And there are lots of stories. They're kind of anecdata, right? There's so many stories that it becomes data, or somebody can do a PhD. If anybody listening, if you're looking for a PhD thesis topic, turn this into robust data. There's stories like when municipalities wanted to save energy costs, so they switched from their sodium light bulbs, the yellow street lights, to LED.
Yes.
They save energy. But what they actually save much more of is maintenance costs. Because the light bulb lasts longer, you don't need as many crews going around and changing light bulbs. Or there's another one, avocados. When they started to use avocado chilling warehouses, and they started to flex the temperatures up and down a little bit, to take advantage of time of day pricing of electricity, they had to put in so many temperature sensors that they were able to stop batches of avocados from going off. And that paid for the system, not the electricity.
So this goes to actually the heart of how we venture build, right? Which is that we look always for a carbon pocket. So, how are we going to reduce emissions? So if you take Moon AI and the noodle factory, that's through energy costs primarily. And then we look for a value pocket. So how are we going to create more value for this business? So of course, if you're reducing energy, there's lower costs. But what's really the incentive? So again, something like reducing rejection rates, that could be the incentive. Reducing maintenance rates, that could be the incentive. So I think it's we often kind of assume that businesses will do things like optimize energy just for the sake of optimizing energy for their energy bills. But actually, that's something that we've not seen at all in this region. Most people look at the cost of electricity as the cost of doing business, and they're very much focused on growth. So you've got to give them another incentive that actually goes to something that they care about in order to get to scale.
And there's another good one, which is if you are making something and it's got quality variations, then if you only find out about them when your product goes to a customer, whether it's cheese or noodles or in my ancient life, I did this on photographic paper just before the Kodak moment. If you only find out about a non-conformance when a product is shipped or after it's shipped, when it's used, then there's a big opportunity by improving your process control using AI. It will also help you on the energy front, but it will improve your
customers, right? Your customer service,
customer experience. Exactly.
So
your quality.
So that's exactly what we're looking for, right? We're looking for those incentives.
Now, Marie, we've got to do the big reveal because we have trailed at that. And I in my introduction, I said that I really hope people enjoy this episode for a reason which we're going to reveal. And the reason is that you and I have been talking about you hosting a few episodes in your region, using your network, maybe a few of the people that I know, and actually sitting, in a sense, the other side of the microphone and being a guest host of Cleaning Up.
Yes, I'm very excited. I'm very excited for two reasons. One is, Cleaning Up is a great podcast. I think, Michael, you've done a tremendous amount of work kind of getting some of these topics out. And then secondly, I'm very excited to share with your listeners more about my region. So all of my following episodes will be in different countries. We'll actually go into market, kind of similar to what we did with the noodle factory, right? Just try to give people a little bit of perspective of what the green transition, what decarbonisation looks like across the region. So very excited to share my region with your listeners.
And I'm equally excited. Now, I'm not going to ask you to reveal some of the people you've already approached and started to talk to. It won't just be portfolio companies. It won't just be SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. You'll be talking to some of the bigger business people and some of the officials and policymakers and investors and so on. Although, initially we're talking about 3 episodes, perhaps by the end of the year. So we'll try and get as interesting a set of people, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then we'll see, if the audience is resonating and enjoying it, then
so they've got to listen, right? If they want more.
It is such a diverse region that I'm now, even as I say that, I'm thinking 3 episodes, big deal. That's not going to represent it, is it? But we can get started.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic to get started and fantastic to show the different countries in the region.
Very good. And I will look forward very much to my next visit back, because we will have a chance, I think then you and I will debrief periodically, either in person, maybe when you're in London or if I'm back in the region, and talk about what we're learning and sharing our observations with the Cleaning Up audience.
Yeah, fantastic. Looking forward to it.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for your time today and for the fantastic visit to Bihun Noodle, People Bihun Factory.
Yeah, delighted to have you.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.
That was Marie Cheong, business builder, venture capitalist operating across South and Southeast Asia, and a new guest host for Cleaning Up. As always, we'll put links in the show notes to resources that we discussed during our conversation. And with that, I'd like to thank Oscar Boyd, our producer, Jamie Oliver, the video editor, Kendall Smith, our head of operations, who's been working overtime on this Asia tour, the rest of the team behind the scenes at Cleaning Up, and of course, the leadership circle, without whom none of this would be possible, as well as you, the audience, for the time that you spent with us here today. Please join us this time next week for another episode of Cleaning Up. Cleaning Up is proud to be supported by its leadership circle. The members are Actis, Alcazar Energy, Arup, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, Signum Capital, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP, Euroelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, Schneider Electric, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you're enjoying this episode, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse our archive of around 250 past episodes and to subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live.